Very good. Okay, so the final question here is what can the general public do to aid in the campaign to support Aboriginal women and affected Aboriginal communities?
What the general population can do to aid and help the issue of violence against Aboriginal women in Canada, United States, and I think throughout the world, first and foremost, is to always just never be afraid to talk about it. I think whenever you see instances of violence, to speak out, always to speak out about it. There are various organizations. There's Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International that have always done great work as far as exposing things, not only in Canada but across the world. It is odd sometimes to see, Human Rights Watch doing investigations on missing and murdered women in Canada, because we always feel like, oh, we're safe and everything is pretty, but at the end of the day, their violence does exist. And I think taking initiatives like you are doing, as far as making films, doing art, going on walks, there's so many families across the country that are oftentimes too scared to speak out or can't speak out because they don't have a voice. I think when you lose a loved one, there's this stillness, and out of all the missing and murdered families that I've met, you'll always find, one strong family member that will be the voice for the 15 or 30 or 60 or 80 or 100 people that remain speechless almost for the rest of their lives, because they can't really wrap their head around why an individual would want to commit such a violent act on a person. So I think taking those kinds of initiatives, writing letters to your local MPs, as far as telling them things that you hear about within the community, and being like, why isn't this bus stop lit at night? Why isn't there a rape telephone on campus in this area? Or counseling offices that have, anonymous boxes to put information on certain people. And so I think there's a lot that can be done, both in person and then on the internet as well, as when you see, the cyberbullying, which is pretty huge as well, because it leads to other things. So I think it's leading from this position of power, and as young, students, as well as using art or literature, those talents, to really use that as a platform to speak about it.
All right. Is there any experiences that you could share with us, just as closing thoughts?
Tons of experiences. What kind of experiences?
Just what was your first, other than the Nicole Hoare thing, what was your first real experience with the violence against Aboriginal women?
I think there's a few that I can sort of summarize into one quick thing, as far as the violence that I've seen or heard about since taking on this project. While we were shooting Highway Tears, one of the interviewees was a guy called Ron Windsor. And his cousin is Immaculate Basil, who still remains missing to this day. And we were up in his community interviewing him, and his mother had been murdered near the downtown east side in Vancouver. On one of the last days that I finished editing the film, he had contacted me by Skype to tell me that his cousin had walked off with 3 people and never came back. I did everything I could to contact every single RCMP officer, police officer, community leader, to try to help them to find her. And she's still missing to this day. So it's, I just saw him maybe a year ago at a presentation in Prince George. But it still hits me very hard, because a lot of the people that I interviewed many that aren't shown on the film became almost like family members or really good friends. And you can see that pain within them. And then I think one of the second, there's probably too many to count, but I would say as far as things that will forever mark me was a couple of weeks before we screened and premiered in Toronto with the Toronto Film Festival and Human Rights Watch was Loretta Saunders was murdered in Halifax, and she was a university student, and she was Aboriginal, and she was doing her thesis paper on missing and murdered women. And that really struck a chord, I think, in the Canadian news community, because when we screened, I think every single news outlet wanted to know why this was happening. So essentially, her work, she really shed a light on it. And through that experience, I met her sister, Delilah, and her family, who have since become fairly, close to me, and I'll always look out for them. But there's we always try to do fundraisers or whatever we can to ensure that these sorts of things don't happen. And her case, it was over rent money. So those kinds of things, as far as hoping that history doesn't repeat itself. And as a full circle, my friend who I talked about earlier, who had also moved to Halifax, and was a big supporter for Loretta Saunders. As it comes almost full circle, she had raised thousands of dollars for the Loretta Saunders Scholarship, ended up being murdered as well. So these are two young women from a notoriously great place in Canada who have sustained such great violence, and they were brilliant young women. So I think those experiences and some of the stories, every city I went to, usually our Q&As would go way longer than anticipated, because once one person starts talking and you realize that out of a room of 200 people, there's a good more than half that have had a family member sustain a horrendous act of violence, that we have a lot of work to do in terms of trying to bring, use the term lightly, a little bit more harmony to our communities.
Okay. Oh, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.